What's up, my friend? My name is Ted Rice, and today I'm coming to you from Bali, Indonesia. And I've had such an incredible experience here. I've been here for 2 weeks with my wife. I will be updating you in a solo episode with her. So hopefully you're excited about that. But I'm super excited to share with you this episode today because I have one of my favorite people, one of my top 5 favorite people to learn about nutrition back on the show. His name is Chris Masterjohn. He's got a PhD in nutritional biochemistry, and he's just one of the brightest people out there, period, when it comes to understanding the intricacies of nutrition and especially the biochemistry involved with that. And what does that mean for you? Well, have you heard about the carnivore diet and you're interested in whether that might be something you should do? Well, we're going to talk about that today. How about nutrigenomics, the science of eating for your genes or your particular genetic makeup? Well, we're going to dive into that. And let me tell you something. I get guys like Chris Masterjohn on the show and have conversations with him because these are the guys, Chris in particular, is one of the people who has that perfect mix of having a deep knowledge about this subject without any of the typical biases that you get with people who just are promoting one thing or another. In other words, they're more marketing and less information, but they use sciencey sounding terms. Chris is one of the real deal people that I go to learn from when I'm trying to get results for myself, for my clients, and just super excited to have him back on the show. You're going to learn all about that and more. Before we get to the episode, just want to let you know, if you are new to this show is all about upgrading your mind and body. And if you're looking to make a breakthrough in your health and level up your life, you're in the right place. So make sure wherever you listen to this episode, whether that's on iTunes, Stitcher, another podcast app, click that subscribe button to make sure every time one of my episodes goes live, you'll be the first to know. All right, can't wait to share with you today's episode with Chris Masterjohn. Let's get to it. Chris Masterjohn, thanks so much for coming back on, man. So excited to speak with you today.
Great to be here, Ted. Thanks for having me back on.
Yeah, and the one thing that I talked about before we hopped on and recorded today, put this down on audio, is there are a lot of people out there, Chris, who have so many misconceptions about nutrition. And in particular, I'd love for you to address some of the popular diets that are being popularized out there. So, for example, I got into a back and forth with some people on the carnivore diet, and they were so dogmatic about their approach, about their beliefs, because they got such great results. And these aren't people who had an autoimmune condition. I know Jordan Peterson and his daughter have gone on Joe Rogan, and everybody knows about the carnivore diet from that. These are people who are looking for weight loss. And then so people might hear that and say, oh, maybe I should just stop eating plants and just eat ribeye steaks cooked in butter a couple times a day with some sea salt. And maybe that's the way to losing weight, to keeping it off, and to achieving optimal health. And so I'd love to dive into that, and we can talk about maybe the ketogenic diet and intermittent fasting as well if we have time, and then really transition into sharing how someone listening right now can maybe not go down one of those roads and learn how to personalize their own nutrition routine. Does that sound like a plan?
Sounds good. One of the things I hear you saying there is a problem that I think is pretty universal across these different diets, and not really just diet, anything in life experience, that is, I think, the source of a lot of misconceptions and is maybe the sort of main one that plagues them all, which is people have a tendency to generalize in 2 ways that are not legitimate. So the first one is to generalize from their own experience to everyone else. And I think it's sort of obvious why that's a problem, and that's that different people are different, and we all have different nutritional needs. And sure, there's going to be some window within which we vary, and there aren't anyone who is going to do well on a zero food intake, for example, everyone's going to starve to death. So there are some hard and fast rules, but there's a lot of variation. And so just because something works for you doesn't mean that it's going to work for someone else. I think that most people are not quick to realize that, but most people are a lot quicker to realize that and appreciate that than they are to appreciate the second principle, which is you can't generalize from yourself to yourself, because your nutritional needs change over time, and there's no reason that you can be certain that what is working for you now is going to work for you forever. And more importantly, what's working for you now may ultimately cause your undoing in the long run if kept up. A sort of obvious example of that is you may get tremendous benefits from fasting, but if you keep on fasting indefinitely, you will starve to death. And so, there may be a time in your life where a 3-day fast is good and some other time in your life where a 3-day fast is not good. That would be an example of your needs changing over time. But it's also the case that at no point in your life can you ever fast indefinitely, because that would be the cause of the fact that you eventually would not tolerate fasting is that you've been fasting so long. So I think as an example with the carnivore diet, on the one hand, the fact that you benefit from the carnivore diet doesn't mean that everyone else benefits from the carnivore diet. And I think, there's a lot of people will appreciate that right off the bat. Some people will appreciate that at first. Some people won't appreciate that at first. They will generalize to everyone else, and I'm not picking on carnivore. The vegans would do the same.
Great point.
but people are quicker to realize that, because all it takes to sort of undo this misperception that you can generalize from yourself to other people is encountering other people with different experiences, right? So if your evidence for the carnivore diet is that the carnivore diet worked for you, then if someone else comes on the scene who says they tried the carnivore diet and it didn't work for them, all of a sudden that's evidence poking holes in your belief that you can generalize from yourself to everyone else. Now, granted, there's sort of like a chauvinistic tendency that we all have that will kick into gear and we'll say, well, that person was doing carnivore wrong. And
right.
The vegans do the same thing. Oh, your health fell apart in veganism. You were doing it wrong. And they'll brainstorm like 3,000 different ways that you might have been doing veganism wrong. So there is that tendency, but a person who's not like completely absorbed in their own dogmatism will eventually learn just from interacting with other people that other people are different from them. It's, however hard that might be, it's way harder to learn not to generalize from yourself to yourself. And, that might sound like it's hard because that probably what I said just probably sounds stupid. Of course, myself is myself. But the thing is, yourself now is different from yourself in 3 years and is different from yourself 3 years ago. And you're constantly moving through time. And so you can't generalize from yourself to yourself in the sense that you can't generalize from your current self to your future self or your past self. And I don't mean you can't generalize anything. I mean, you can't be certain of that generalization, right? So it's possible that whatever you're doing right now that's working is going to work forever. That's clearly possible. And there's some obvious cases where that's always true. Like so far I've always counted that the ground's going to be beneath my feet when I walk out the door. I'm probably going to be right about that in perpetuity. And there might be things about my diet that I'm going to be right too. Like, maybe it will always be the case that my gut gets a little messed up the more sugar I eat. But in the case of, just to give you an easy example for me that's a little more sophisticated, that isn't directly related to carnivore necessarily. I love the example of a menstruating woman who has the genes for hemochromatosis. So hemochromatosis is a condition of iron overload. Most people, when they get too much iron in their body, stop absorbing iron from their food. People with hemochromatosis don't have that regulation. They keep absorbing iron. Women lose iron through blood loss during menstruation, and a woman with a heavy menstrual flow will lose an enormous amount of iron. And it's quite possible for a woman to have a lifelong tendency towards anemia that she needs to correct by including a lot of liver, shellfish, and red meat in her diet. I guess this is relevant to, actually, this is relevant to carnivore, so we can relate it to carnivore. So a carnivore diet is going to give you better iron status than any other diet. Why? Because even though plant foods have a lot of iron, like in my current diet, I eat so many legumes and vegetables that I get like 4 or 5 times more iron than I do from my meat when I'm eating red meat, which is rich in iron. But I have genes for hemochromatosis, and on a diet like that, my iron doesn't go up. Why? Because vegetables are extremely high in compounds that prevent iron absorption. And in fact, plant protein prevents iron absorption, and animal protein enhances iron absorption. So, if you have anemia and your iron isn't moving, even though you're eating 4 or 5 times the RDA of iron from plant foods, stop eating plant foods and eat red meat, shellfish, and organ meats, and I guarantee you your iron will go up and your anemia will be resolved. So a carnivore diet would be great for this woman who has a heavy menstrual flow and this lifelong tendency to anemia. She probably would, and that's not why most people are on carnivore, don't get me wrong, but still the carnivore diet would be great for that application, especially if it's based mostly on red meat, organ meats, and shellfish. So this woman goes on this carnivore red meat, organ, shellfish diet, and she knows when she's anemic because she feels weak, weakness and fatigue, and her hair is falling out. Then at some later, but she doesn't know the physiology behind it, so she has no reason to measure her iron levels, get a complete blood count, or think about the mechanism involved, or even the relationship to her menstrual flow, right? So let's say she's not that educated about nutrition. So now all of a sudden she stops menstruating. Maybe she went through menopause. Maybe she went on birth control. Maybe her carnivore diet was so restrictive that she developed hypothalamic amenorrhea because she wasn't eating enough calories and she wasn't eating enough carbs, and her body felt like she was kind of starving, and so it shut down her menstruation. Now she's not losing that blood loss. Guess what? She has hemochromatosis genes, and the heavy menstrual blood loss has been protecting her against hemochromatosis for the entire length of her history of menstruation, which is now stopped. And so there's going to be some transition period, but eventually what she's going to need is, either to donate blood to relieve the iron or to stop eating so much highly absorbable iron. And it could be that the carnivore diet based on red meat, organ meats, and shellfish that was reversing her anemia now is going to be the diet that causes iron overload. And what's going to be crazy is that fatigue, being tired all the time, feeling run down and fatigue and your hair falling out can be a sign of iron overload. And so she could easily start experiencing this and be like, oh, this is when I'm anemic. This diet must not be enough to resolve my anemia. Maybe I should take iron supplements and, or double down or triple down on the diet, eat more of those foods, whatever. The point is that this time, all of a sudden, this diet is bad for her because it's providing so much highly absorbable iron that it's exactly what she doesn't need now. And so, she was generalizing from her present self to her future self, and she was wrong. What she needed in the future was opposite of what she needed in the present. And to take an example that's more highly related to why most people who are doing the carnivore diet are actually doing the carnivore diet, let's say right now your vitamin C status is not that bad. If you go on a diet that has 20 milligrams of vitamin C in it would probably take you many years to develop scurvy because maybe you were getting 60 milligrams of vitamin C on an omnivore diet, and that dropped down to 10 to 20 milligrams of vitamin C on a carnivore diet. Believe it or not, meat is normally is not a meaningful source of vitamin C at all on a mixed diet. But if you're eating nothing but red meat, organs, and shellfish, you will probably hit 20. You might hit 20 milligrams of vitamin C. You'll definitely hit at least 10. And that could be enough to, if your vitamin C status is not that good and you go on a zero vitamin C diet, you'll probably develop scurvy in months. But if you go from half decent, mediocre vitamin C status to 20 milligrams of vitamin C a day from your diet, you're not going to get scurvy in 3 months. You might get scurvy in like 6 years or something like that, right? And so right now, your vitamin C status is okay, but you got this autoimmune condition that's worsened by plant foods. And that autoimmune condition is the problems it's giving you are 5 to 10 times more significant than any nutritional deficiency that you might have. Well, you go carnivore and you're fixing your worst thing that's 10 times worse than your next problem. But your next problem isn't that bad because you haven't been on a restrictive diet that causes nutrient deficiencies. You've been on an omnivore diet that provides at least mediocre status of all the nutrients. But now your carnivore diet might take 6 years to give you scurvy. 5 or 6 years later, the autoimmune condition might be gone, but your next biggest problem, which was nutrient deficiencies, is now all of a sudden 5 to 10 times worse than it had been when you started the carnivore diet because your diet has been pretty deficient in those nutrients. All of a sudden, 6 years later, your carnivore diet might be the cause of your biggest problem because you are developing scurvy. And to go on a carnivore diet for a year and to have just harvested the best fruits of that diet, which is resolution of your autoimmune condition, and to generalize from yourself now to yourself in 6 years to believe wholeheartedly and firmly, to believe 10 times more strongly than anyone else has ever believed that because a diet worked for them, it would work for anyone else. To believe 10 times stronger than that because this diet is so amazing for you right now, it will continue to be astoundingly amazing 6 years from now could be absolutely completely wrong. And so, a lot of people who are on these diets, they like their reaction to this is to say, well, the RDA for vitamin C is set at 90 milligrams because it was devised with people eating plant foods, and eating plant foods is wrong. And so eating plant foods must increase your need for vitamin C. And so
that's what Sean Baker said, right? That's what was claimed, right? That you didn't need as much vitamin C. That's what he said in an interview with Joe Rogan, that you don't need as much vitamin C.
Yeah, well, so he made that up. I mean, look at it this. Look at it this way. The RDA was based on human trials that looked at what dose of vitamin C will maximize the immune function of your white blood cells when they draw your blood and measure the ability of those white blood cells to defend yourself against pathogens. No one has done that study in carnivores. So I didn't talk to him about it. So he might have written it up somewhere or talked about it somewhere, and I didn't see it because I don't follow him too closely. So I don't want to put words in his mouth, but he's probably, I'll emphasize probably there, he's probably assuming that because people are carnivore for a year or 2 years and don't develop scurvy, their needs must be lower. For the reasons
I believe that's what he said, actually, something like that. I don't think he was citing hard evidence, but he cited, a couple of people, actually, 2 people who had been on carnivore eating just meat for, I guess, over 10 years who, purportedly don't have problems doing it. Of course, only 2 people, but that's what he brought up as an example.
Yeah, I mean, there's also a published case report of a guy who was on a carnivore diet for that long and developed frank clinical scurvy. And people look at that and are like, well, the dude was eating canned meat. And yeah, he might have developed scurvy because he was eating canned meat. And these people might have not because they were eating meat that wasn't canned. But for God's sakes, we're talking about 3 people here. We don't really have that much variation.
Don't really know
to address it, So look, like, yeah, I mean, if you didn't develop, also it's like the intensity of the scurvy is relevant, and it's kind of like it's almost like, who cares? Why are we talking about scurvy? So like the RDA for vitamin C wasn't set based on scurvy anyway. The RDA is like massively more vitamin C than you need to prevent scurvy. It was based on maximizing antioxidant protection and immune function. And so the fact that they didn't develop scurvy doesn't mean that they have. So the RDA for vitamin C, they reviewed a bunch of research, and some of the research was research that showed that at a particular plasma level of vitamin C, the risk of cardiovascular disease and a handful of cancers that happen to correlate with vitamin C intake and plasma levels are at their lowest. And so then they looked at experimental studies, and there's no experimental studies show, over the course of 10 years, what dose of vitamin C lowers the risk of cardiovascular disease or a particular cancer type the most. But there are shorter term experimental studies where they dose vitamin C, and then they, like I said before, they take out your white blood cells and they look at, okay, how functional are these? What degree of oxidative stress do they tolerate? What's their ability to activate in response to pathogens? And those functional markers of vitamin C status, the plasma level that maximizes those is extremely close to the plasma level at which the diseases bottom out in the observational literature. So they said, look, it's not that we have every I dotted and T crossed, but we're crossing all the T's and dotting all the I's that are published, and they all kind of line up to say the same thing, which is you need 90 milligrams of vitamin C a day if you're an adult male. Now, I actually think they were being conservative with their own data. They were basically saying, look, you get like 80% of the diet from this, and then you only get like another 10%. It's not the diet. 80% of the benefit when you get up to this level, and you only get 10% of the benefit when you go up another 20 or 50 milligrams, and you only get another 10% when you go up another notch. I think they would have set it at 150 milligrams per day if they were maximal protective value. And so, look, I mean, if you're going to look at something like cardiovascular disease risk or cancer risk, you can't determine that from two anecdotes of people who were on this for 10 years for a bunch of reasons. One is that those diseases take a lot longer than 10 years to develop. Second is probably, I'm not familiar with those cases, but in all probability, they're not old enough to have gotten heart disease or cancer. And third is, over any given time frame of 10 years, most people aren't going to get heart disease and cancer, even when you're investigating age groups that are highly vulnerable to that. Eventually, if you measure people old enough, then yeah, most of the people will die over the course of a 10-year study. But if you take someone in their 40s and you say who gets cancer over the next 10 years, cancer rate's going to be so low that you're going to need a sample size of thousands of people to get any meaningful data. So yeah, I mean, 10 years with no scurvy is good evidence of the principle that it is possible to be on a carnivore diet long term and not get scurvy. But that's not evidence that you're not going to get scurvy on a carnivore diet or that someone else isn't going to for 10 years. Another problem you have here is the exact same problem you have with veganism, which is basically the same thing as carnivore, except you exclude animal foods instead of plant foods. I mean, it's otherwise the same principle.
Sure.
In veganism, and we have the difference is we have 50,000 times more data about vegans than carnivores.
Interesting.
Because people have been vegans for a long time, and a lot of people are vegans. There are hardly any carnivores even right now, and no one was a carnivore 10 years ago. So there's a bunch of published studies about vegans. There's not a bunch of published studies about carnivores. Okay, look, this is the case in veganism. What are the health outcomes associated with veganism? There's a degree of who cares that you have to respond to this question. Why? Because vegans are self-selected. And so who self-selects an extreme diet? And then who stays on that diet? Well, I guarantee you that people who are genetically predisposed to do poorly on veganism are not the people who are staying on a vegan diet for 10 years, right? If you go on a carnivore diet and your health starts and you're the first thing you notice is in 2 weeks your gums are bleeding, how long are you going to stay on that carnivore diet? You're probably going to disown it relatively quickly. You stay on the carnivore diet because it was working for you. And so, how big is the subset of people for whom a carnivore diet works? Well, if our sample size of people that were on a carnivore diet for 10 years and didn't get scurvy is 2 people, that's a lot fewer than the number of vegans who survive and don't get serious clinical deficiencies over 10 years.
Yeah.
But we have no data. I mean, one of the things that I would criticize about the veganism data, like my own experience was that I went borderline psychotic on a vegan diet. My teeth fell apart, right? So
And why did that happen, Chris? What was the nutrient deficiency that caused those effects?
I don't know. I have some speculations, but I don't know. I mean, for all I know, it could have been cholesterol because my cholesterol was like ridiculously low at that time. I have a suspicion it could have been vitamin B5. But it could have been multiple things. It definitely wasn't B12 because I was taking B12. So I kind of I really want to get a whole genome sequence when I want to save up money to get one because I think that might provide some answers. But right now, I don't have a good answer except a handful of possibilities. But
Chris, could we transition into that a little bit and talk about maybe some gene testing? Because you mentioned just like for the carnivore and vegan that people self-select. So in other words, if you're listening right now, what does that mean? It means, I changed to a whatever diet. It doesn't even matter. And you start to feel good. And you're like, hey, this diet is amazing. I tried this other diet, but none of them made me feel good. But now I'm doing something that makes me feel good. And I must have discovered the diet that's great for everyone. When in reality, there's all these other factors that come into play. And we're not even going to talk about a person who may have changed other aspects of their lifestyle. Let's just say everything else is the same, but they started doing a different diet and all of a sudden they're feeling great. But what Chris is saying is that there's these underlying reasons why someone might do well. So Chris, first of all, you said, I want to get my genome sequenced, and someone may not understand what exactly you mean. Just to chime in there, so you can buy these DNA testing kits and you can swab your mouth, you can send it away for $200 or $300 or $400, whatever it is, and you get something back that supposedly tells you what your genes are and then gives you some advice on what to do. But the reality is, they're not sequencing your genome. So those tests are based on untrue or I guess guesstimations of what genes you might have, but not, they don't go in there and test them. Can you talk a little bit about that and how you would use maybe some genetic information to personalize your diet?
Yeah. So the main ones that people are using now are 23andMe and Ancestry. They do directly measure your DNA. Like the things that they're reporting are measured, but they're not perfectly accurate on everything that they report. And there are some possibilities for errors. They're not really guesstimating the genes. However, however, it's not a whole genome sequencing, and there's a bunch of limitations. So first of all,
guesstimation. So they are taking what is it that they're doing then? Or they just taking a snapshot?
They're taking cells from your saliva, and then they're measuring 500,000 polymorphisms. A polymorphism is a variation in a gene, and there are 3 billion nucleotides. Nucleotide is a building block of DNA. The polymorphisms, the variations that 23andMe measures are called single nucleotide polymorphisms, or a lot of people call SNP, that's abbreviated. A lot of people call them SNPs. And so that's 500,000 nucleotides out of 3 billion, which is, like an extremely small percentage of the genome.
So they're just not checking for everything? Is that what the issue is?
Well, there's a few issues, but to narrow it down, the difference between that and a whole genome sequence is that a whole genome sequence measures all 3 billion nucleotides. Now, there are a few reasons why that's better. First of all, and actually I should back up and clarify something. 23andMe gives health reports, but the number of health reports that they give are limited. And in addition to health reports, they also give ancestry reports. And they use something called a chip in their measurements. And this chip has the capacity to measure those 500,000 polymorphisms, and they optimize that chip for the ones that they're reporting on. So what a lot of people are doing are they're downloading the raw data file that has all 500,000 polymorphisms, and they're uploading it into a third-party software that generates a report about stuff that 23andMe doesn't report on. So the thing is, 23andMe is optimizing the chip for the reports that they're giving, which means that although they measured the other, another almost 500,000 things because they report on hardly any of it, most of their chief concern is not the accuracy of that other stuff. So they're measuring it, and they might do something with it at some day. They're not like trying to make it wrong, but some accuracy, or whether they measure the thing or not, is going to be sacrificed on those other things in order to get the best accuracy and completeness that they can for the things that they're reporting on. So you're sort of like, when you're using the third-party apps to analyze your 23andMe data, you're kind of getting like the crumbs that fell from the table, in the sense that, there's no particular reason to think the thing would be wrong on those polymorphisms, but you don't have the full confidence and authority of 23 having optimized the analysis for that purpose. But so that's that. But let's just sort of like take for granted that you're measuring these 500,000 things. Well, one of the problems is, for almost any disease, they don't really do a comprehensive testing. So, for example, like, I know for a fact that I malabsorb fructose, meaning when I eat fructose, or when I eat something that generates fructose, such as sucrose, which is common table sugar, about 2 hours later, I have this enormous spike of hydrogen gas produced by bacterial activity in my small intestine because I didn't absorb the fructose into my bloodstream. And I don't know if I have hereditary fructose malabsorption, which is a genetic condition where you can't absorb the fructose because of your genetics, or if I have some other problem that is causing secondary fructose malabsorption, meaning maybe I have bacterial overgrowth in my small intestine, and that's causing me to not absorb the fructose because it's damaging my transporters or whatever. So I can look at my 23andMe account at hereditary fructose malabsorption, and it says I don't have the genes for hereditary fructose malabsorption, and then it has a note that says you still might have hereditary fructose malabsorption because you might have one of the genes that we didn't measure.
Right.
So
it's not complete.
Right. And that's partly because their model is direct to consumer, and they got in a big fight with the FDA about whether they could do direct to consumer health related genetic testing. And so this was always true even before the spat with the FDA. But part of the reason that it's worse now, in the sense that they're never going to move towards comprehensive diagnostic testing, I don't think, is that their model has basically been to stay away from diagnosis to satisfy the FDA. They'd have to kind of go in the complete opposite direction of designing it to comply with the regulations around diagnostic testing.
And why are they going to do that? Because that's going to be insane amount of money, and they may not get it back. In other words.
Yeah, exactly. And there's people who do diagnostic genetic testing. The whole point of them is to do something different and direct to consumer, right? So the fact is that there aren't any diseases that have comprehensive diagnostic utility with 23andMe, because you might not have the gene for it that they measured, but you might have the gene for it that they didn't measure. And so it's a very limited utility from a diagnostic perspective. There are certain things like, it's very common for people to want to know their MTHFR status, which is a gene involved in folate metabolism. Folate is one of the B vitamins that supports mental and physical health. And so a lot of people want to know this, and 23andMe does get that comprehensively, because there's only 2 polymorphisms that people care about, and 23andMe gets both of them. So you can be confident about what that is, but that's not really a problem. That's like, it's just super popular to be concerned about those 2 polymorphisms. That's not a disease, right? When you're talking about genetic risks for a disease or genetic diseases, there are usually a lot of polymorphisms that could cause them, and in those cases, like 23andMe is hugely unlikely to have all of them. Like familial hypercholesterolemia, a condition where your cholesterol levels are always super high and you have a very high risk of heart disease early in life. They measure a bunch of genes for it, but there's hundreds of polymorphisms that can cause that, and they don't measure them all. So you can't rule it out at all. And it can cost you thousands of dollars to get comprehensive genetic testing for it, which is one reason why even doctors don't run the comprehensive genetic testing, because they just look at it like, I'm going to give this person a statin either way, so why do I care if they had this disease?
Very important. I had a client who they told, hey, you have familial hypercholesterolemia, and I asked him, well, did they do the genetic testing? And he said no. So it's like, how do you know that then? Right?
Yeah, I mean, to a certain extent, it's like you can infer it with pretty high confidence under certain circumstances. So, for example, if someone has a cholesterol of 350, right off the bat, they probably either have familial hypercholesterolemia or they got a thyroid problem. Like one of those two is very likely to be true. But then you look and you find out that one of their parents
on the keto diet.
Yeah.
Or drinking butter in their coffee.
The keto diet is going to lower your thyroid activity, and that is part of why your cholesterol is going to rise. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think if you got cholesterol 350 or higher, you got a serious problem on your hands. And
okay.
Yeah, I mean, the keto diet's like in the context of a thyroid problem or heterozygous familial hypercholesterolemia, the keto diet might easily push it that high, but in the absence of any predisposing factors, I don't think it's going to push it that high usually. But anyway, okay. So one of the problems with 23andMe is that the genetics of disease is usually incomplete. There are also some things that aren't SNPs, that aren't single nucleotide polymorphisms. So for example, in your saliva, you have an enzyme called salivary amylase that digests starch into sugar. And one of the roles is to help you regulate your blood sugar response to starch, because the sweet taste in your mouth activates some preparatory insulin release from the pancreas that helps you get a more mild blood glucose response to that starch. And there's a ton of variation from person to person in this, but the variation is not in SNPs, it's in copy number. It's called the copy number variation. What that means is if you have 8 times more salivary amylase than I do, it's probably because you have 8 genes and I have 1. Actually, I think the minimum is 2. So it's probably like you have 16 and I have 2. And 23andMe doesn't measure copy number variation. So that's another example. What the whole genome sequencing is all 3 billion nucleotides. And so for any given disease, it measures all the genes. It measures copy number variations. So both of those problems are solved. And then also, it has the possibility to find new mutations. And this probably isn't of concern to most people, but I think it's of concern to people who have highly unusual health problems. I think a lot of people who have highly unusual, unsolvable health problems are often people who have some kind of inborn error of metabolism, which means a genetic defect in a biochemical pathway. And it's just because it wasn't bad enough to cause some serious problem like childhood seizures, then it just kind of got ignored. And, like the older they get, the worse things get. I think for people like that, whole genome sequencing has the ability to just discover that, for any, like they'd be able to, they might already be doing this, I'm not sure, but in principle, you can just compare the exact genome that you have to the average genome from the population samples and have a computer algorithm identify all of the deviations and map them to the genes and map the genes to the function of that gene and the symptoms of defects in those pathways, and then just sort of like algorithmically find these mutations that you didn't know about that could explain your symptoms. And the company doing whole genome sequencing now is Veritas, and they offer 3 tiers. The highest tier costs, I forget exactly how much, it's somewhere between $2,000 and $3,000, so it's very expensive. And they have the highest tier is for this. So they have a molecular geneticist, a medical geneticist who will catalog your report of signs and symptoms if you have any serious health problems with a long health history and you don't know what the causes are. And then they will look for any mutations that might explain it. And those might be novel mutations that haven't even been identified in the literature before. And so you can't do that with 23andMe. 23andMe is it's sort of like maybe this haystack has like 50 needles in it, and you're looking for 50 needles in a haystack because you know about those needles and they're all important. The whole genome sequencing is like, let's characterize the whole haystack and like find new things that are unimportant. If you need to optimize your chip to measure 500,000 specific things, you need to already know why those 500,000 things are important. If you're sequencing the whole thing and characterizing everything, you can find new things and discover new things. And, that's not important for the average person, but I think we underestimate how many people have like low-level genetic defects in pathways that do contribute to health problems. People don't get resolutions, they don't get diagnoses, and they just kind of go on operating at a very substandard level. I think there's a lot of people that don't get any help because like they don't fit into any particular box. And I think that number of people is probably a lot larger than we think it is, but it's still, it's still not most people. Like maybe it's a few percent of people, certainly not the majority. But you asked me what my why I was like completely devastated mental and physical health on veganism. So my suspicion is that I have a genetic defect in the metabolism in the synthesis of something that is not at very low levels in a vegan diet, very high levels in organ meats, and was not in any of the supplements that I was taking when I was a vegan. So I don't think it's zinc. I don't think it's vitamin B12 because I was supplementing with those things. But so one of my hypotheses is that I might have a defect in turning pantothenic acid, which is vitamin B5, into coenzyme A, which is a universal participant in energy metabolism. And when I was on a vegan diet, so like when you eat vitamin B5 in foods, 85% of it is as coenzyme A, or is another closely related compound called 4-phosphopantothene, and 15% of it is things like pantothenic acid. And you partially digest it when you eat it into various breakdown products that include pantothenic acid, but are also like intermediates in the pathway to synthesize coenzyme A that are easier to put through that pathway. And there is a very rare genetic defect in the ability to synthesize coenzyme A, and you can basically all the animal models of the disease suggest that you can cure it just by feeding people coenzyme A. Well, how do you feed someone coenzyme A? You eat it in food. And it's B5 natural, but there's no coenzyme A in the market as supplements. So I know that I wasn't supplementing it when I was a vegan. It's extremely high in organ meats compared to anything else, which is what I was eating when I just sort of like completely healed myself from all of the problems that caused veganism. I was eating like a pound of liver a week and things like that. So extremely high in organ meats. It is high in nutritional yeast, but I wasn't eating nutritional yeast when I was a vegan, so I can exclude that. And
so yeast is alive enough to not fit into. Yeah, I'm just making a joke, Chris. Man, we're getting down an interesting rabbit hole, but I want to make sure that the listeners are able to take away something and apply it to themselves. So you talked about so many things. I just want to recap a little bit. You talked about how 23andMe, or at least, correct me if I misunderstood, but 23andMe, it sequences these 500,000 SNPs, and that's a decent place to start if you're really interested in your genome and you just have to have it done, but you don't have any pressing real issue. You just want an idea. And to see like your MTFR status, because it covers both of those polymorphisms. So you'll learn that. but you're not going to get too deep into it because it doesn't look at everything. But for someone who's suffering from a major, well, at least to them, some major issue, and they've been to doctors and they haven't figured it out, and they've consulted maybe with some quote unquote functional medicine people, and still nothing. Maybe looking into Veritas and getting that whole sequencing done to point out some differences between what should be, I guess, like you said, the average genome, human genome that is fully functioning, and then theirs, and maybe pinpoint some issues there. Am I on track with that? And if yes, what else can someone do? Because I know you have this nutritional testing sheet, and I'd love to dive into that next.
Yeah. Okay. So I think 23andMe is valuable enough that I've gotten it and that I use it. But the number of things that 23andMe generates that I think are useful is a pretty small proportion of what 23andMe generates. Like there's not 500,000 things that are useful in 23andMe from a diet and health perspective. So there's a half a dozen things that I think are of pretty high value in looking at in terms of leading to actionable steps with your diet. And that's largely reflective of the fact that most of the data on the relationship between diet and genetics is really messy. So I think there's a ton of stuff out there that is just like making recommendations with pretty flimsy research behind them in terms of relating your genetics to your diet. So there might be, some 1 or 200 SNPs that people are out there relating to diet, but I think, the ones that I have a lot of confidence in are a very small proportion of that.
You said 6. Is that what you mean?
I was making up a number, but like, okay, so I think in methylation, which is an area where I think the genetics are really interesting. There's like 1, 2, 3. There's like 3 that I think are super useful, and then there's a couple that I think are interesting, and then there's like a handful that like people measure and they're probably impactful, but they're not like they're probably impactful on your health, but they're not super informative about diet. Well, actually, there's a couple of genes that I consider don't be vegan genes, is what I call them, and I don't
funny.
consider them to have any utility because I'm never advising vegans, right? So, some of the things that I think actually are useful is just like I'm getting back reports and I'm looking at them, and if I were going to tell someone to do anything, I'd just be telling them to do what they're already doing. Whereas, that might be more useful if someone's coming to me and saying like, do I have any genetic predisposition to do poorly on veganism, that I might use those particular genes more. Those are just genes that are like, the genes involved in synthesizing certain things that are only found in animal foods, such as turning beta carotene into retinol, which is the animal form of vitamin A and the form that you need, converting the plant forms of the essential fatty acids into the animal forms of essential fatty acids, which are the ones you need, things like that. But yeah, I mean, my point is that there's utility there. The utility is pretty limited. I think the utility is smaller than what some of the people who are giving like giant reports to people are believing. For Veritas, I haven't used it. I've advised one client to get it. I think he would benefit a lot from it. I think I would benefit from it. I just am not willing to spend $3,000 on it right now, but I'm willing to spend it on that in the future when I have some other higher priority things. And I would say that probably anyone who has long-standing bad health problems and is getting no resolution from other things that they're trying, if they can afford it, and I don't know if anyone's insurance covers this or not, but certainly if the insurance covers it, for sure, it would be great to get the whole genome sequencing. You might not find anything, but you might find a mutation in something that explains your symptoms and maybe gives you actionable steps to address it. And it's sort of like the whole genome, there's a limit to it, right? Like you could analyze biochemical stuff of what's going on in the body sort of like endlessly before you find what you're looking for. But when you measure the whole genome, you don't know that you're going to find the problem, but you know that you're going to find the problem if it's genetic, because you're measuring the whole genome. And also the biochemistry, like you measure someone's cholesterol or you measure their organic acids or whatever it is that you measure in their blood or their urine, those are all affected by context. Like, how long have you been fasting? What have you been eating? How old are you? Like, just all the things that are going in your body are constantly altering those things. Whereas your genes, you're born with your genes and they stay the same. So a genetic analysis, if it's complete, is divorced from all those contextual factors, and you have a much firm. Like, for example, when medical geneticists are testing people for genetic mutations in that mess up their metabolism, they might have to do a lot of testing, and they might have to put someone on, like, for example, say someone has a fatty acid oxidation disorder. They might get wrecked by fasting or by eating a high fat diet. And they might go into the doctor. They might look for specific abnormalities. They might have to put that person on a high-fat diet or fast them for a while to provoke the abnormalities that they're looking for in their blood or urine. But your genetics you were born with your genetics, and they're always your genetics. And so if you have a complete whole genome sequencing, you will find a mutation in any relevant gene for that fatty acid oxidation disorder, because it's not affected by fasting. It's not affected by high-fat diets. It's not affected by any of the contextual factors that you're concerned with.
Right.
So
you're born with it. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a very high probability that if you couldn't find it in thousands of dollars of other testing, if it's genetic, you will find it with whole genome sequencing and the expertise of a medical geneticist from Veritas that works with that test. But yeah, but for the average person, right, for like general preventative stuff, for most people, I think we can go to some much more universal principles. So before I was saying that there are two key principles of individualizing. That is, the way I stated it before was you can't generalize from one person to another. You can't generalize from yourself to yourself. So put another way, rule number one is different people have different nutritional needs. And rule number two is your nutritional needs change over time. And so for that reason, you need to have data about what's actually going on in your body in order to understand what your current needs are and what you should currently be doing in order to be healthier. And so I think the appropriate way to do that is to piece together three categories of information. One is lab testing, blood and urine tests of the things going on in your body that reflect your nutritional status. The second is dietary analysis. Know what you're actually eating and how you match up to the expected requirements. And then the third is your signs and symptoms. That means subjectively, what is happening to you? What is your experience? And you mentioned my cheat sheet. So I have a digital product called Testing Nutritional Status, the Ultimate Cheat Sheet. And that basically is a comprehensive system that walks people through those three things. So there's an index of 180 signs and symptoms of nutritional deficiencies, toxicities, or imbalances. And you can use that as a checklist. And then I've also I've given instructions for tracking your diet and how to do it properly. And then I've collected all of the sort of either the gold standard tests of nutritional status or their closest approximations that are available commercially. And I think this is, to give you an example of how hard this is to navigate, this was the product of spending hundreds of hours on each nutrient, doing intensive research, including research to understand what are the validated markers of nutritional status. To give you an example of what I mean by validated, there are very elegant studies where they took people who had an adequate diet and then they kind of locked them up on a college campus and gave them a zinc deficient diet. They measured markers in their blood such as their plasma zinc, and then they looked for signs and symptoms. And we know from those studies that when your plasma zinc falls to 70, you're likely to develop small patches of dry skin. And when it falls to the next interval, you're likely to get a sore throat. And when it falls to the next interval, you're likely to get diarrhea. And we know that when you supplement X amount of zinc over time, you watch the plasma zinc go back up and the symptoms resolved. That's a very well-validated marker of nutritional status. It's not only well-validated that it goes up and down according to your zinc status, but it's so well validated that we have very precise cutoffs for when symptoms start and when symptoms are severe. We don't have that level of data for every nutrient. Some nutrients, for copper, we know that serum copper is the most sensitive thing that goes up and down in relation to copper status. But the ranges that we have don't have good cutoffs to know exactly where the most sensitive signs of copper deficiency start to develop. But at least we know that serum copper is better than a dozen other lab tests that have been developed. And the understanding how well validated something is super important to two things. One is getting the right information, but the other is not wasting money. So imagine someone who doesn't have complete insurance coverage for all these tests, which is quite often the case, and who doesn't have unlimited financial resources, which is almost always the case. That person doesn't want to waste hundreds of dollars on testing that they don't need. So someone who hasn't spent hundreds of hours analyzing the literature about what are the well-validated tests involved here is likely to think that they can save money by getting a $390 panel that tells them their status for every nutrient by by their particular methodology. What they don't realize is that test is, they're looking at this test and they're saying, well, I'm going to get more lines of data for fewer dollars from this test, and I don't have the money to get some of the more expensive tests. What they don't realize is that that's $390 on a test that was not scientifically validated at all, and that if you understand the biochemistry and physiology, you would understand is probably is almost certainly giving you wrong information, at least for some of the nutrients. And so, this person, if they were going through the cheat sheet, would be they'd go through the process of first assessing the time and financial resources, insurance coverage, et cetera, that they have to devote to these processes. If finances are limited and it's important to save money, they would not be directed to buy the cheapest panel. They would be directed to not get upfront comprehensive nutritional screening in lab tests and instead go to looking at signs and symptoms, which is free. Then you narrow down the testing that you need based on your signs and symptoms to the most highly probable nutrients. When you're guided to the most highly probable nutrients, you may not need any testing because the action plans that the cheat sheet advises might be super low risk for you, and maybe you just need to try adding a certain food to your diet. It's so low risk that for free you can try adding the food and see if it resolves something. Or the cheat sheet might advise you, look, we talked about the woman at the beginning of this as an example of how needs change over time. Say that woman who has the hemochromatosis genes and was protected from iron overload by lifelong menstruation that actually made her vulnerable to anemia. And we said before that her symptoms could be fatigue and her hair falling out with low iron or high iron. So maybe this woman looks up fatigue in the index, then cross-references it to iron, some of the B vitamins, and a couple other things. Based on the rest of the cluster of her symptoms, it all looks like it's either iron overload or it's iron deficiency. Well, then she spends $60 on an iron panel because it's going to make the critical decision, the critical difference between opposite action plans, such as eat more iron-rich foods or donate blood and get rid of your excess iron. For that, when you have two opposite action plans where doing the wrong one might be harmful and doing the right one might be life-changing, it's worth a $60 iron panel. So you've been walked through. You've been walked through to get the $60 iron panel. Instead of getting $390 worth of useless information because you were trying to save money, you spent no money that led you to spend $60 on the right test that gave you the life-changing information. So it's getting the right information. It's also doing it in an effective manner. Whether you're concerned with time effectiveness or cost effectiveness, it helps you manage the right way to get the right information and develop the right action plan given the resources that you have.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. And it's something that I've been using with my coaching clients to troubleshoot issues. And also, like you said, narrow things down so that if some testing is needed, that we don't just, if someone's concerned about the cost, some of my clients aren't, they're fine to get the comprehensive, but if someone's concerned about the cost, we can kind of narrow it down and maybe try some things that are low risk, like you said, Chris, or getting into a situation where we can say, hey, well, we're not sure what to do here because the symptoms for too much or too little are very similar. But what we can do is just test it and then go from there. And it's been super powerful and helpful. And it's something that you don't need a coach to do if you're well-versed in this stuff, if you're quite analytical. It's something that, really everybody can do if they have the time to sit there and be diligent about going through your process that you've laid out.
Yeah, I mean, there's, there are people who just they get the thing and then they just pay me to figure it out for them. That really depends on where you are on that scale, right? Like someone who's going to pay a coach to do something is not in the strictest of financial straits most of the time. But there's like someone who really the limit of what they can spend on their health is $24 is probably going to spend that time invested in figuring it out themselves with the signs and symptoms and waiting until they can really afford it. Everyone's going to negotiate that trade-off between time effectiveness and financial cost effectiveness differently according to the time and finances that they both have and are willing to devote to this. But it's designed to hold your hand and walk you through it. But so like I had someone email me so by the way, this thing goes for $30 with for your audience. There's a 20% discount that brings it down to $24. I had this woman emailed me the other day who was like, how can this possibly be $30? This is nuts. I'm spending hundreds of dollars per month getting coaching on this. This is basically the information that would bring me to the same place. But look, for most of us who could afford, I mean, if I had unlimited financial resources, I would be paying for business coaching. I'd be paying for psychotherapy. I'd be paying for a bunch of stuff that like everyone could benefit coaching, whether they admit it or not.
Absolutely.
But at the end of the day, even as a coach, wouldn't you rather have someone come to you who had done a little bit of homework, who had sort of ruled out the low-hanging fruit that they could help themselves and actually has like a genuine thought-out process that they want your help with, rather than someone who just came in having no idea of anything? I mean, that's a better opportunity for you to help that person with your unique contribution. And for people on the client side, wouldn't you rather save spending money on a coach after you've done for yourself what you could by yourself, so you go into that coaching session prepared so you can get the most out of the coaching session? And as a coach, don't you want the people who come to you to feel like they are going away with the best possible session that they could have? So I think to give people some independence to get even part of the way there, if they're not going to go all the way by themselves, I think just makes all the time better spent and the experiences better generated for one-on-one coaching when that does take place. So I think it's a great guide even for some people to sort of have with the people they're coaching, and to look at it together and to have a common rationale and understanding for why they're doing the testing that they're doing. Too often someone goes into the doctor and says, I want X, and they get Z. Because they're not on the same page about why they're testing the things that they're testing. So I think it would be great to have better education on both sides and to have doctors and patients, or coaches and clients, actually be on the same page and of a common mind of why they're doing the things that they're doing. And so I think it can facilitate great coaching or doctor-patient interactions as well.
Yeah, no, I agree with that 100%. It's really about empowering people, and empowering if that person is working with a coach or their doctor to really Right. Be on the same page, be an educated patient, and be on the same page about what the testing or why the testing is being done. So important, man. And thanks so much for putting together such an incredible resource, because I just want to reiterate for those listening right now, like, this isn't Chris's opinion. That he's like, hey, it's not his opinion. He's looked into the research, done, like he said, hundreds of hours on each nutrient. It's just an incredible resource. And it was just updated. I'm going to say recently, but I'm a little bit lost for time because I've been traveling around and living this crazy digital nomad lifestyle. But I think about maybe 6 months ago, was it? You updated it, so it's new and improved right now?
Yeah, it was a few months ago, and it's gonna be going through repeated rounds of updates. So what I'm doing is I'm intensively researching, like re-researching each nutrient, making a giant podcast out of it, and then going back and revamping the relevant section in the cheat sheet. So it just keeps getting better and better, and the updates are actually free to people who bought it. So invest now, and you're getting a just sort of you'll just keep getting it updated and updated for free.
It's like a stock that grows in value and never gets lowers in value.
Yeah, pretty much.
You're like, yeah, that's not how I like my work being referred to, but whatever. Yeah, cool, man. Well, listen.
Invest in this ever appreciating asset.
Yeah. But so for those of you interested, like Chris said, he has a special discount. So it's typically $30, which is worth way more than that. I don't know why you sell it for that low, Chris. That's insane. But
people can buy it.
Right, exactly. But there's even a discount, a 20% discount just for the Legendary Life listeners. And where can people go to get that, Chris?
That's at chrismasterjohnphd.com/legendarylife. And of course we can make sure that notes in the link is in the show notes too.
Yeah, absolutely. So chrismasterjohnphd.com/legendarylife. And you can get the nutritional cheat sheet and start dialing in your own nutrition, because the future of nutrition is personalization. It's not the next best-selling diet book on the New York Times list. It's not something trendy like the carnivore. It's really getting more detailed and specific to your needs. It's using genetic testing when it's warranted, or going through something like the nutritional cheat sheet to help pinpoint what's going on, what your symptoms are, and how to resolve them. It's not going to be just doing keto or just start intermittent fasting. Everything's going to get better. As Chris has so eloquently, stated today, those things, they might help, but they might not. But even if they do help, you won't understand the underlying reason why. And we need to get past those superficial. Well, we don't need to. You can be stuck. But if you are looking for the next level, let's get past those superficial recommendations and start getting a bit deeper so that you can truly enjoy the health that is available to you. But it's going to take some personalization to make that happen.
Indeed.
Well, Chris, man, thank you so much. It's always an education when you come on the show, man. I just sit back and listen and try to hang on for the ride. And, I always learn so much with you. Thank you for being so generous with your time, with your information. And again, thank you for putting together this cheat sheet so that we can all start to get more specific about what we do for our health and for our nutrition.
Yeah, it was fun, man. Thank you so much for having me on, Ted.
Absolutely. We got to do it again soon.
For sure.
That wraps up another episode of the Legendary Life podcast, and I hope you got a lot out of today's episode. And let me tell you, if it was a bit over your head, make sure you bookmark it, you listen to it again. I listened to these episodes myself multiple times when I get a guy like Chris on, because there's so much information about the SNPs and the different types of genetic testing and the whole genomic sequencing, as well as all the things about the carnivore diet and personalizing your nutrition and how your body will change over time. So if you're using something now and it's working, it may not work in 6 months or 6 years. You've got to adjust as your body changes. So important. And remember, if you want that nutritional cheat sheet, how to test your nutritional status, go to chrismasterjohnphd.com/legendary life. That's chrismasterjohnphd.com/legendary life. I usually do a bit of a recap, but I'm not going to, because I know this was a bit longer. And I'll just say this, listen to it again, because I'll be doing the same thing. It's so great to have guys like Chris on, and I know it can be hard to keep up with them sometimes, but these are the guys to learn from if you truly want to master nutrition and master your nutrition, your approach to nutrition. Everyone else out there is promoting something, marketing. It's really about personalization. It's not about the keto diet or very low carb diet or low fat diet or veganism or anything like that. You've got to find what works for you. That's what it's all about. That's what I help my clients with, and hope you appreciate what Chris and I did here today. So with that said, hope you have an amazing week. And again, check out that testing nutritional status, that nutritional cheat sheet that Chris was talking about, if you want to try to hack your own nutrition. Wish you the best. Talk soon. Lots of love. Peace.